the instructor for Environment and Society. Welcome to the class. This is the first lecture. So today's is a bit of a short lecture, just explaining what environmental sociology is, and I'll go over some of the aspects of the course, which is all on the syllabus, but I thought I'd explain it a little bit more. The lecture's notes will be available on Brightspace as well as the video of the presentation. So before we get into what environmental sociology is, I thought we'd go through the basics of what social science is. So social sciences, or scientists, seek to discover what is probably true about the social world and to develop theories, explanations for what we discover. So the point here is that the social sciences are research-based, and that any claim about how the social world works is rooted in like a community of scholars who agree that certain methods and certain ideas are useful to make claims. So discoveries about the world are made through careful and honest research in the ideal. Research is simply the collection of data. Data makes the social world observable to us and therefore comprehensible. But data also is full of error. So when we collect information, we have to ignore certain parts of the social world, either because we think they're, for theoretical reasons, that those aspects are irrelevant, or because we aren't that smart and we forget that something might be relevant. Anyway, so data collection involves making the world observable, but also it has error. So obviously, to have a good explanation of something in the social world, you want as least amount of error as possible. So if you completely miss the boat and you misinterpret your understanding of the social world, your data is not going to be useful. Therefore, your explanation for your data is not going to be useful. So loss of information is simply error. Ideally, we want to have the right information. And this is true of either quantitative or qualitative social science. So sociology is a social science, and it's social science insofar as it's research-based. So you do have social theory, which is also research-based, but it doesn't involve data collection very often. So it's more speculative. It's still part of sociology, and many disciplines have kind of their theoretical traditions, but you'd be surprised about how irrelevant social theory is to sociology. There's only very, very few people purport to be social theorists in the sociological tradition. Now, we do draw on sociological theory when we're doing our research, either we're testing hypotheses or we're building explanations. We do rely on theory, but it's not, those theories are more what we call mid-level theories. Anyway, I won't get too far into that. So sociology is social science, and we're a science because we collect data, we interpret it, and we try to offer explanations for what the data reveal. So because we do this, we're empiricists, which means that we only accept something to be true if there's data to back it up. So if there's something in the observable world that allows us to believe something to be true, we can accept that. But if there's no evidence, there is no truth. So there are speculative forms of sociology that are simply the interpretation of data without being rooted, well, scratch that. I don't know what I'm talking about. Empiricists, just for the point of this, to make this point, are just people who agree that claims about the truth have to be supported with evidence, and that the method by which you get the data has to be acknowledged as useful to the discipline. So in sociology, we have our favored data collection methods, where it's maybe a survey or ethnography, focus groups, content analysis, data collection, stuff like that, as long as the method is a method that we accept as being reasonable enough to allow you the unbiased collection of data, then we say that your data is good enough for us to then be empiricists, which means that we'll pay attention to your story. This is why sociologists very often will critique each other's work, not necessarily based on the results of the data collection, but by pouring through what happened with the data collection. So if there's flaws in your research methods, then there's no point in even considering the data as relevant. So to be a sociologist, to be a social scientist, is to be a methodologist, to really understand the benefits and the limitations of each research method. One of the core ontological assumptions in sociology is that the social world is a balance between social structures and individual agency. Okay? Now, the idea of a social structure is foundational to sociology. It's one of these ontological assumptions. An ontology is just a theory of being, a theory of what exists in the world. So we speculate that these social structures exist in the world. That's our ontology. A social structure comes from all the patterned behaviors in the social world. So a bunch of people acting more or less in unison or following roles and norms, those patterns create an epiphenomenon called the social structure. But those social structures then place real limits on our individual agency, our ability to choose a course of action. Now, one of the problems with the idea of social structure is it's almost impossible to define. So in sociology, I've never seen a really useful definition of a social structure. It's kind of like we know it when we see it. So the economy is a social structure. The family as an institution or an idea is a social structure insofar as the idea of a family or many families is culturally encoded, and most people will perform that culture as they go about their lives. So that places limits on people's imaginations about what the family is, or limits on people's imaginations about what the economy is. Now, the economy is just the division of labor, how people get food, clothing, and shelter. But it places limits on our behavior insofar as we can't just do whatever we want to make a living to get food, clothing, and shelter. There are rules, whether they're formal or informal, on how people trade goods or money for services. And this creates a certain economy. The government will create certain policies that will favor certain styles of economic organization. So these are social structures. Insofar as they're institutionalized in societies, they vary by societies. But strictly speaking, social structures are epiphenomenal, which means that they change as the result of social change. So as individuals make their individual choices, if those choices become patterned in new ways, then the social structure will change. So a good example of that is, again, in family life. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a narrower conception of what a family was. It would have been the nuclear family, heterosexual, male breadwinner. By the 1970s and into the 80s, there were more cultural changes and social norm changes where people who were living together without getting married formally were also now considered a viable family form. Again, heterosexual, not necessarily with the male breadwinner for a cohabitational unit. So as Canadians or North Americans in general started to change their family life, the social structure of the family also changes. Now, obviously, in the 1990s and 2000s, gay marriage became legal and gay cohabitations gained even more legal standing, where we see more and more changes in the pattern behavior of coupling life in Canada or North America. This creates the new social structure of the family. So today, just due to changes on the ground and how people interact and how they couple and how they live with each other, we see changes in the social structure of society. And when you see those changes, then people make different types of choices. Okay, so this is how social change is likely to happen or one mechanism but the point here is that social structures are secondary to the sum total of people's individual agency. So as individuals, we have the ability to abide by norms, rules, and cultures and stuff like that. But the small number of people who might be countercultural do not change social structures. It's when most people start to change their social interactions that we see changes in social structures. Now, in sociology, there are three levels of analysis. And again, I'm just getting to what environmental sociology is by giving you a refresher course in what sociology is in general. So a level of analysis is just a focus of attention. So if you're a sociologist who's a demographer, you're going to study populations. So you're interested in population level dynamics. What happens at the level of populations is different than what happens at the level of face-to-face interaction, symbolic interaction. So you could be a sociologist of the family and do a demographic study on family life. You're interested in the sum total of a country or province's populations, social interactions in terms of the family. So we can chart how marital unions change over time at the level of the country. And we can compare countries, so that's macro. But if you're still interested in the family, but you weren't interested in the population, you're interested in dynamics within the family, maybe the gender division of labor in the home, or the decisions people make financially as they, as resources come in. That would be a more micro level analysis, right? So you're looking at individuals you're looking at them in the face, right? So at the population level, you're hovering over a country in your UFO and trying to see patterns. At the micro level, you're trying to see patterns at the level face to face. But we also have institutions and organizations in society, so businesses, corporations, government agencies, where they're not big populations, but they do provide constraints and opportunities at the level of the face-to-face, but they also impact the patterns of behavior that we see in the population. So meso level of analysis is one that looks at clusters of people in usually formal, but sometimes informal organization. Okay, so this matters because when I get to the discussion of environmental sociology, we want to pay attention to the fact that some environmental sociology is micro, some is meso, and some is macro, and sometimes you can combine these things. Another aspect of sociology is our understanding of culture and socialization. Okay, so socialization is the process through which we learn culture. And it's through socialization that we develop personal and collective identities. So we develop a sense of self. This is different than a sense of personality, right? So in sociology, we really don't pay attention to personality. We could, but I can't think of very much sociological research, maybe some social psychological research that incorporates the idea of personality into an understanding of social life. But socialization is where we learn our culture, how we learn our culture, either primary socialization, secondary socialization, institutional socialization, things like that. So we learn what the rules of the game are in certain contexts. So cultures are complex. Individuals have multiple roles, and those roles change over time. So we learn the meanings and social significance of roles and practices and norms through socialization. And insofar as we become experts in our culture, we will have a collective identity. It could be a subculture or a national culture, but just the subtotal of our face-to-face interactions with others will also help us to develop a sense of self, a sense of who we are in relation to other people. We'll have different statuses as we take on different roles. Okay, so again, this is, if you're an environmental sociologist, you might want to learn, incorporate these types of ideas or assumptions about how the world works into your practice, which I'll talk more about later. So culture is the shared symbols, rules, values, norms, roles, and practices that are meaningful to a group of people. Okay, so that's probably the most succinct definition of culture that I can think of. It's complex, but when you're studying culture, you're really studying symbols, rules, values, norms, roles, and practices. Okay, now culture can be material and non-material, which simply means that culture is full of ideas. Some of the ideas are enshrined in physical objects. So think of a totem or any sort of product that is created by humans. It has some meaning, right? So a stone axe has meaning, but so does an iPhone. An iPhone is not just a tool, it is a symbol of one's social status or a symbol of one's allegiance to the Apple Corporation over any other smartphone maker. I don't know. So culture is, when you're studying it, you want to focus on the material culture that people will incorporate into their everyday lives, but also the non-material culture that informs our everyday lives. Now, culture patterns group behavior and makes many aspects of social life predictable. What this means is that it's because of culture that our lives are relatively stable, even if they're odd. And all that stability just means that people are acting in expected ways, more or less. When people act in expected ways, more or less, you have patterns. When you have patterned behavior, you have social structure. So culture is a social structure that informs other social structures and creates the patterns. Now, again, people have individual agency. We can always act outside our culture. We can always innovate and add new cultural components. All cultures change over time. Therefore, all social structures change over time. Now, another thing that we often look at in sociology is the idea of power. Okay, so power is commonly defined as the ability to have one's will executed despite resistance. That comes from Max Weber, famous foundational sociologist. Now, other people have different definitions of power, different uses, analytical uses of power. So if you look at someone like Foucault in the 1970s and 80s, he didn't see power as something that is held. He saw it as something that is kind of fluid. It's not that interesting and it's not that useful for a sociologist to think that way. And Foucault, is interesting, but it's hard to tell whether he's right or wrong because his ideas are not necessarily falsifiable. So in sociology, most of us would recognize that there is power in the world, right? So someone will be able to have you do what they want you to do, even if you don't want to do it, right? So, but some people's use of power gets out of control. So for instance, someone could say that I have power over students in this class because I demand critical review assignments from you. So if you don't want to do the assignment and I say you have to, otherwise we won't pass the course, then people say, well, I have power over you. Students are victims of faculty power. That's not truly, that's not accurate in its definition because it's actually a contract. You take the course, you see that there's certain assignments due in certain days, you see their worth, and you choose to abide by that rule. And if you don't, you know the consequences, which means you don't pass the course or you can't take the course or what have you. So, this in this example, I would not have power. I have entered into a relationship or a contract with you that says within the general policies of the university, you pay tuition, you take courses, I deliver the courses, I assess your work by giving you a grade. You do this a bunch of times and hopefully you get a degree, and that degree will more than make up for its cost in terms of increasing your labor market value. So here, society has power over us. Society, our culture, our educational culture, puts us in this virtual room. But because of rules and regulations and the voluntary nature of education, there is no power in this relationship, right? Now, there are many ways to hold power in society. Social status can give us implicit and explicit and implicit power. Wealth can give you more power. Institutional and organizational positions give you power. So if you are the CEO of a corporation, you have the power to give someone a promotion, or you have the power to give someone a promotion if they do what you want them to do, which might be making money or whatever, right? So power is different from having differential life chances. So someone born in North America to a middle class family doesn't have more power over someone born in a poor country. So I'm born poor in a poor country. They simply have different opportunities. And again, people will say, no, this is privilege, and privilege is power. That's not quite what's happening here, right? It's just the dumb luck of being born middle class in North America affords you opportunities that might create more poverty. Who knows? That's another course. But you don't have the individual ability to have that poor person do what you want. Right? And if you did, it would probably be because of some sort of social norm or social position than about anything else. But anyway, so groups of people can have power if they have a collective will that is executed despite resistance, right? So it is fair to say that politicians have power over citizens, right? So even though we have rules and laws and regulations that say that politicians can't do whatever they want, they do have the ability to work together to pass new rules, laws, and regulations that allow them to do whatever they want. So democracy can be fragile. So we do have to pay attention to group power, people who can organize and have their will executed despite resistance, but also individual power. So when we analyze the social world from a sociological position, where we do want to assess who has power and how they're wielding it. Now, power can be deployed with force, but force tends to be met with resentment. So in a democracy, you have very little actual force in the enforcement of individual or collective power. Because when you force somebody to do something, they tend to resent it. They tend to then see that you're the one who is forcing them to do something, and then they're going to focus their resentment on you. That's not efficient. So most power in societies is contextualized by legitimacy. So you could have a culture that legitimates one's ability to wield societal power through birthright. So many societies, small societies or even large societies, will be organized in a way where one person, because of who their parents were, has the ability to hold power over everybody else. You can also have power enshrined in laws, policies, and regulations, which allow for some people to use force and other people not to use force. This is a way of legitimating power. When power is legitimated, people just act according to the rules and accept that some people in certain circumstances have power over you. So most power in society is power that's enshrined in some sort of cultural mores or some sort of formal policy, law, or regulation that we then just come to accept. It's a trade-off because we accept it for social stability. All right, so what does all this have to do with sociology or with environmental sociology? Environmental sociology is the attempt to understand the consequences of social life and the processes. Poorly written, sorry about that. So environmental sociology is simply the attempt to explore how social life impacts the environment, in quotes, and to understand how the environment impacts social life and processes. Okay, so it's sociological only insofar as the audience of this research is other sociologists, and insofar as the sociological methods and traditions that are normal in our discipline are used. So environmental sociology is not environmental science. It's not human geography or anything like that. It's a very narrow group of people, basically. I mean, there's thousands of environmental sociologists, I'm sure. But it is a group of sociologists who use sociology to understand the relationship between the social and the natural, or the social and the ecological, or the social and the environment. Now, the reason why I put the environment in quotes is because it's like a social structure where we use the word in commonsensical ways, but as a scientific word, it's kind of tricky. And it's tricky, some people would argue, because human beings are natural. We are part of the environment. We are part of the natural environment. We evolved in certain ecosystems, and we've adapted to certain other ecosystems. Um, the very type of body you have is related to the body of your ancestors and where they had subtle genetic changes. Um, so to say that the social is different than the environment is to separate out humans from the natural world and say that our social dimension is more important than our natural dimension. Okay, so some people say that those things have to be combined. I'm not really one of them. I think that it's fine for us to recognize uh, individual or recognize that we are biological beings with complex social lives that who are affected by social structures, and that these are different focuses of attention than the non-social aspects of our lives or the non-social environments in which we find ourselves. So, in the first chapter of Nathan Young's textbook, he talks about how some sociologists say that we need to kind of combine this recognition that the social and the natural are the same thing. That really doesn't get us very far, in my opinion. I haven't seen much scholarship that is interesting or useful when we do that. So I maintain the separation between the social and the natural, but I also recognize that there are certain ways that we need to understand the social and the natural together. Social biology is a really good example, even though for some reason it's not really popular in sociology. Social biology is a research that looks at the natural foundations to some human behavior, but also looks at the biological changes over time that the human body experiences in certain settings. So we know that, because of epigenetics and gene expression, that the social and natural environment in which you grow up will affect how certain genetic codes are activated in your body, which will then change as you go up throughout your life. But anyway, so that's just an example of how the natural and the social can be analyzed together. We also try to look at how natural structures and social structures work together. So we have to acknowledge that the climate, our climate change, the ecosystems in which we find ourselves, the level of pollution and toxicity in the environment has real consequences on social life and societal or in societies in general. Um, and some disasters that befall some societies or all societies are sometimes natural disasters, but sometimes social or disasters that are socially caused. So, our current pandemic is a consequence of probably humans and animals living in close quarters. So you don't see a lot of new or a lot of disease in early human societies, especially viral diseases. So you see more viral diseases as we started to domesticate animals and started living close with them. Then there's more likely that animal diseases are going to jump to humans and human diseases are going to jump to animals. So to really understand the consequences of, say, a pandemic, something that is both a natural disaster and a socially caused natural disaster, we want to understand social life, understand how it is that humans interact with non-human beings, domesticate them, or how we interact with wild animals, how we manage wild animals. So these are, again, are places where you can separate out the social from the natural, then combine them into an explanation. You don't necessarily, because like our social lives are so complex and our societies are so complex compared to many other organisms that the social is worth contemplating outside of the environment or the ecology in which it's set, or the natural world, which also feeds back into it. Okay, so I agree with many environmental sociologists who say that any sociological explanation that doesn't have a natural component is going to be incomplete. And 90% of sociology really doesn't meet that criteria. So 90% of sociology ignores the natural environment or the natural biology of our being. So obviously there's exceptions. So something like medical sociology, sociology of health, these are or social biology. These are disciplines, subdisciplines that necessarily assume that human beings are natural. But in other subdisciplines, it's surprising. So if you look at something like the study of inequality, we barely, it's only been recently that sociologists have started to look at the biological consequences of poverty or the biological consequences and social psychological consequences of discrimination, stuff like that. Usually when we look at inequality, we're just looking at the maldistribution of social goods, whether it's because of socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sexuality, what have you. Anyway, I think I've exhausted this slide, so let's move on. So what isn't environmental sociology? Well, environmental sociology is not conservation, nor is it environmental activism. Okay, so the sociology part is just pure research, research for its own sake. So research that you hope other researchers will find interesting and who will spark debate, will spark new knowledge. So while conservationists and activists can certainly use knowledge gained by environmental sociologists, the knowledge itself doesn't have to be useful to anyone outside environmental sociology. So this is true of all sociology. So sociologists primarily do their research for other sociologists, but that research becomes relevant or interpreted or used in non-sociological ways. That's fine. So many conservationists and activists will employ environmental sociology. They're more likely to use natural science. It's more directly applicable, or climatology and stuff like this. But it certainly, our repertoire of knowledge is available and can be useful for non-sociological uses. So that noted, many environmental sociologists are also conservationists and environmental activists. So some, or if not most, environmental sociologists actually care about improving our natural environment and preserving it, including all the wonderful beings that exist. So they will sometimes partner with conservationists and do research on demand, or do research that is tailored to benefit the conservationists. I would say that's not sociology. It's fine, and it's good to do that, but it's not necessarily sociology, or sociology in parallel with conservation, which means that those environmental sociologists might study or conduct a study that is useful for a specific conservation group, but they might also publish that study for other sociologists. So then it's sociology. So if somewhere in the chain other sociologists are the audience, then I'd say it's sociology. But if you are, say, a contractor and you're a sociologist, you're hired by an organization to do research to benefit them, and you don't publish that for other sociologists, then you're a conservationist, or you're a sociologist who's done contract work for a conservation organization. That's fine. That's a legitimate thing to do. Get really good money doing that, or you volunteer your time, and that's a very good use of your time. So that wouldn't be environmental sociology. That would just be conservation science, I'd say. Okay, and the same thing if you're an environmental activist producing environmental sociology. I know a number of people who publish for sociologists, but also try to ensure that their research is beneficial to environmental organizations. And I have no problem with that. I think that's perfectly fine. Now, having said that, we also have a lot of collaborations and growing collaborations between social and natural scientists. So there's a lot of research now that is being funded that tries to combine social and natural scientific research because there's a clear recognition that most of the emergencies, environmental emergencies that we face, are socially caused, and their solutions are going to be social solutions, right? So we don't know that things are happening without the natural science. sciences. So we don't know that climate change is human caused until climatologists can do their research and confirm it. But if it's just climatologists doing the research to confirm that climate change is human caused, we're not going to be able to solve it because we need to know why it is that we can't stop burning fossil fuels in North America, um, or why we need to extract so much or dump so much carbon in the atmosphere in general. We won't know if natural scientists and engineers develop technologies to pull that carbon out of the atmosphere. We won't know how to get that knowledge and technology incorporated or accepted without social science. And by here, social science, I mean any of the social sciences: psychology, sociology, economics, geography. I probably missed a bunch, but anyway. So in environmental sociologists very often collaborate with natural scientists. I'm doing that myself. So I just submitted a proposal with a geneticist and a conservation biologist in the States, among 25 other people. We're basically studying the North Atlantic right whale, proposing to study. We haven't been funded yet. But anyway, so environmental sociology is interesting as a discipline if you're a practitioner, because it gives you the opportunity to do collaborative research that we really didn't see 20 years ago. So this is a new thing to have natural and social scientists work together on the same project, and it's it has problems. The research has problems, but it gets very often the social sciences just becomes filigree to the natural science. But there are some important results as an outcome of this type of collaboration. So we're more likely to understand the extent of biodiversity, but also understand how people react to the loss of biodiversity. And that could be anything, right? Anyway, I will move on. About this already in general. So some environmental sociologists have called for a new ecological paradigm, and you can read about that in the first chapter of the textbook. And this simply acknowledges that, this suggests that sociology has to acknowledge and incorporate into our explanations of the social world the natural ecological determinants of that social world. It's whether you're studying people at the micro level, people do interact with the natural environment, even if they don't know that. And it has some varying cultural significance in our everyday lives. There are natural limits to societies insofar as we have finite resources that we need for those societies to thrive. So, outside of the whole world going towards nuclear energy, we still extract a lot of energy through carbon and damming rivers and stuff like this, which have ecological consequences. So the new ecological paradigm is just this call for all sociology to explore the natural limits of our societies. I don't really agree with that. I think it's important for environmental sociologists to do that. But you can have very robust, full explanations of the social by just bracketing the natural. Because I don't think we need to throw out all old sociology that doesn't pay attention to the environment or the natural context of human life and social life. I think, anytime that you ask a research question and do research, you do have to ignore a certain aspect of the social world because the social world is so complex. You do have to bracket a lot. So the only real exception to my objection here would be that if your research question very clearly has to incorporate an understanding of the natural world and you don't, well, then you don't have a good explanation. But if it's feasible and justifiable to ignore or bracket the natural world in your explanation, then that's just fine. That's all I have for, so that's all. That's my introduction to environmental sociology. You'll see how that plays out throughout the rest of the course, I suppose. Anyway, so what are the course expectations? I have expectations of you, you have expectations of me. these are all written in laws and policies. So I'm accountable to you insofar as I deliver a well thought out course that allows you to learn about environmental sociology and show me what you've learned. So there are certain assignments that I'll talk about in a second, which fulfill my contract to you. I expect you to be accountable to the course insofar as you just abide by the syllabus. So the syllabus is basically there to allow you to decide whether you want to take the course or not. So if there's anything you don't like about the syllabus, if that dislike is so strong that you can't see completing the course, then it's up to you to drop the course or just accept that this is going to be your life when you take it. So to me, accountability just means that we recognize our role in this course and that we accept that role. There's all my course policies are on there, and then you are responsible for looking at the course calendar and seeing all these other responsibilities that we have. So if you can't meet a deadline for an assignment, if you're sick, that's not a big deal. We'll get you an extension. But if you just forget to do it, or if you're busy at work, or you're busy with other things, I don't give extensions. I'll talk more about that in a second. You're accountable to the due dates because you know the due dates as of last week. So you have to organize your life in such a way that you meet your deadlines. This is university education, so it means that this is all voluntary. I'm not going to, if you don't hand in an